Oh, rats, you're old-fashioned. I may be, nevertheless. Any peculiarities that I've managed to retain to my present age, I plan to hang on to. No. Look, I'll polarize the hull before we raise. How about it? Opaque? Opaque. Grimes slid a regretful glance at his own frumpish boat, but assented by fumbling for the barely visible port of the speedster. Stevens assisted him. They climbed in and straddled the stick. "Attaboy, Doc," Stevens commended. "I'll have you there in 3 shakes. That tub of yours probably won't do over 500, and wheelchair must be all of 25,000 miles up." "I'm never in a hurry," Grimes commented. "And don't call Waldo's house wheelchair, not to his face." "I'll remember," Stevens promised. He fumbled, apparently in empty air. The hull suddenly became dead black, concealing them. It changed as suddenly to mirror bright. The car quivered and then shot up out of sight. Waldo F. Jones seemed to be floating in thin air at the center of a spherical room. The appearance was caused by the fact that he was indeed floating in air. His house lay in a free orbit with a period of just over 24 hours. No spin had been impressed on his home. The pseudo-gravity of centrifugal force was the thing he wanted least. He had left Earth to get away from its gravitational field. He had not been down to the surface once in the 17 years since his house was built and towed into her orbit. He never intended to do so for any purpose whatsoever. Here, floating free in space in his own air-conditioned shell, he was almost free of the unbearable lifelong slavery to his impotent muscles. What little strength he had, he could spend economically in movement, rather than in fighting against the tearing, tiring weight of the Earth's thick field. Waldo had been acutely interested in space flight since early boyhood, not from any desire to explore the depths, but because his boyish, overtrained mind had seen the enormous advantage to him in weightlessness. While still in his teens, he had helped the early experimenters in spaceflight over a hump by supplying them with a control system with a pilot, which a pilot could handle delicately while under the strain of 2 or 3 gravities. Such an invention was no trouble at all to him. He had simply adapted manipulating devices which he himself used in combating the overpowering weight of 1 gravity. The first successful and safe rocket ship contained relays, which had once aided Waldo in moving himself from bed to wheelchair. The deacceleration tanks, which are now standard equipment for the lunar mail ships, traced their parentage to a flotation tank in which Waldo habitually had eaten and slept up to the time when he left the home of his parents for his present, somewhat unique home. Most of his basic inventions had originally been conceived for his personal convenience, and only later adapted for commercial exploitation. Even the ubiquitous and grotesquely humanoid gadgets, known universally as Waldos, Waldo F. Jones Synchronous Reduplicating Pantograph, patent number 296,001,437, New Series, et al., passed through several generations of development and private use in Waldo's machine shop before he redesigned them for mass production. The first of them, a primitive gadget compared with the Waldos now to be found in every shop, factory, plant, and warehouse in the country, had been designed to enable Waldo to operate a metal lathe. Waldo had resented the nickname the public had fastened on them. It struck him as overly familiar, but he had coldly recognized the business advantage to himself in having the public identify him verbally with a gadget so useful and important. When the newscaster tagged his space house wheelchair, one might have expected him to regard it as more useful publicity. That he did not so regard it. That he resented it and tried to put a stop to it arose from another and peculiarly Waldo-ish fact, which is, Waldo did not think of himself as a cripple. He saw himself not as a crippled human being, but as something higher than human, the next step up, a being so superior as to not need the coarse, brutal strength of the smooth apes. Hairy apes, smooth apes, then Waldo. So the progression ran in his mind. A chimpanzee with muscles that hardly bulge at all can tug as high as 1,500 pounds with one hand. This Waldo had proved by obtaining one, patiently enraging it into full effort. A well-developed man can grip 150 pounds with one hand. Waldo's own grip, straining under the sweat until sweat sprang out, and had never even reached 15 pounds. Whether the obvious inference were fallacious or true, Waldo believed in it, evaluated by it. Men were over-muscled, canal, smooth chimps. He felt himself at least 10 times superior to them. He had much to go on. Though floating in air, he was busy, quite busy. Although he never went to the surface of the earth, his business was there. Aside from managing his own properties, he was in regular practice as a consulting engineer, specializing in motion analysis. Hanging close to him in the room were the paraphernalia necessary to the practice of his profession. Facing him was a 4x5 color stereo television receptor. 2 sets of coordinates, rectilinear and polar, crosshatched it. Another smaller receptor hung above it and to the right. Both receptors were fully recording by means of parallel circuits conveniently out of the way and in another compartment. The smaller receptor showed the faces of 2 men watching him. The larger showed a scene inside a large shop, hangar-like in its proportions. In the immediate foreground, almost full size, was a grinder in which was being machined, a large casting of some sort. A workman stood beside it, a look of controlled exasperation on his face. "He's the best you've got," Waldo stated to the 2 men in the smaller screen. "To be sure, he is clumsy and does not have the touch for fine work, but he is superior to the other morons you call machinists." The workman looked around, as if trying to locate the voice. It was evident that he could hear Waldo, but that no vision receptor had been provided for him. "Did you mean that crack for me?" he said harshly. "You misunderstood me, my good man," Waldo said sweetly. "I was complimenting you. I actually have hopes of being able to teach you the rudiments of precision work. Then we shall expect you to teach those butter-brained oafs around you. The gloves, please." Near the man, mounted on the usual stand, were a pair of primary Waldos, elbow-length and human-digited. They were floating on the line in parallel with a similar pair physically in front of Waldo. The secondary Waldos, whose actions could be controlled by Waldo himself by means of his primaries, were mounted in front of the power tool in the position of the operator. Waldo's remark had referred to the primaries near the workman. The machinist glanced at them, but made no move to insert his arms in them. "I don't take no orders from nobody I can't see," he said flatly. He looked sidewise out of the scene as he spoke. "Now, Jenkins," commenced one of the 2 men in the smaller screen. Waldo sighed. "I really haven't the time or the inclination to solve your problems of shop discipline, gentlemen. Please turn your pickup, so that our petulant friend may see me." The change was accomplished. The workman's face appeared in the background of the smaller of Waldo's screens, as well as in the larger. "There, is that better?" Waldo said gently. The workman grunted. "Now, your name, please?" "Alexander Jenkins." "Very well, friend Alec. The gloves." Jenkins thrust his arms into the Waldos and waited. Waldo put his arms into the primaries before him. All 3 pairs, including the secondary pair mounted before the machine, came to life. Jenkins bit his lip, as if he found unpleasant the sensation of having his fingers manipulated by the gauntlets he wore. Waldo flexed and extended his fingers gently. The 2 pairs of Waldos in the screen followed an exact, simultaneous parallelism. "Feel it, my dear Alec," Waldo advised. Gently, the sensitive touch. "Make your muscles work for you." He then started hand movements of definite pattern. The Waldos at the power tool reached up, switched on the power, and began gently and gracefully to continue the machining of the casting. A mechanical hand reached down, adjusted a vernier, while the other increased the flow of oil cooling the cutting edge. "Rhythm, Alec, rhythm. No jerkiness. No unnecessary movement. Try to get in time with me." The casting took shape with deceptive rapidity, disclosed what it was, the bonnet piece for an ordinary 3-way nurse. The chucks drew back from it, it dropped to the belt beneath, and another rough casting took its place. Waldo continued with unhurried skill. His finger motions within his Waldos exerted pressure which would need to be measured in fractions of ounces. But the 2 sets of Waldos parallel to him, thousands of miles below, followed his motions accurately and with force appropriate to heavy work at hand. Another casting landed on the belt. Several more. Jenkins, although not called upon to do any work in his proper person, tired under the strain of attempting to anticipate and match Waldo's motions. Sweat dripped down his forehead, ran off his nose, accumulated on his chin. Between castings, he suddenly withdrew his arms from the parallel primaries. "That's enough," he announced. "One more, Alec. You are improving." "No." He turned as if to walk off. Waldo made a sudden movement, so sudden as to strain him, even in his weight-free environment. One steel hand of the secondary Waldos lashed out and grasped Jenkins by the wrist. "Not so fast, Alec." "Let go of me." "Softly, Alec, softly. You'll do as you're told, won't you?" The steel hand clamped down hard and twisted. Waldo had exerted all of 2 ounces of pressure. Jenkins grunted. The one remaining spectator, one had left soon after the lesson started, said, "Oh, I say, Mr. Jones. Let him obey or fire him. You know the terms of my contract." There was a sudden cessation of stereo and sound, cut from the earth end. It came back on a few seconds later. Jenkins was surly, but no longer recalcitrant. Waldo continued as if nothing had happened. "Once more, my dear Alec." When the repetition had been completed, Waldo directed, 20 times, wearing the wrist and elbow lights with the chronanalyzer in the picture. "I shall expect the superposed strips to match, Alec." He cut off the larger screen without further words and turned to the watcher in the smaller screen. "Same time tomorrow, McNye. Progress is satisfactory. In time, we'll turn this madhouse of yours into a modern plant." He cleared that screen without saying goodbye. Waldo terminated the business interview somewhat hastily because he had been following with one eye certain announcements on his own local information board. A craft was approaching his house. Nothing strange about that. Tourists were forever approaching and being pushed away by his auto guardian circuit. But this craft had the approach signal, was now clamping to his threshold flat. It was a broomstick. But he could not place the license number. Florida license. Whom did he know with a Florida license? He immediately realized that he knew no one who possessed his approach signal. That list was very short. And who could also reasonably be expected to sport a Florida license? The suspicious defensiveness with which he regarded the entire world asserted itself. He cut in the circuit whereby he could control by means of his primary Waldos the strictly illegal but highly lethal inner defenses of his home. The craft was opaqued. He did not like that. A youngish man wormed his way out. Waldo looked him over. A stranger. Face vaguely familiar, perhaps. An ounce of pressure in the primaries, and the face would cease to be a face. But Waldo's actions were under a cold, cortical control. He held his fire. The man turned, as if to assist another passenger. Yes, there was another. Uncle Gus, but the doddering old fool had brought a stranger with him. He knew better than that. He knew how Waldo felt about strangers. Nevertheless, he released the outer lock of the reception room and let them in. Gus Grimes snaked his way through the lock, pulling himself from one handrail to the next, and panting a little as he always did when forced to move weight-free. Matter of diaphragm control, he told himself as he always did. Can't be the exertion. Stevens streaked in after him, displaying a groundhog's harmless pride in handling himself well in space conditions. Grimes arrested himself just inside the reception room, grunting, and spoke to a man-sized dummy waiting there. "Hello, Waldo." The dummy turned its eyes on and held its head slightly. "Greetings, Uncle Gus. I do wish you would remember to phone before dropping in. I would have had your special dinner ready." "Never mind. We may not be here that long. Waldo, this is my friend, Jimmy Stevens." The dummy faced Stevens. "How do you do, Mr. Stevens?" the voice said formally. "Welcome to Freehold." "How do you do, Mr. Jones?" Stevens replied, and eyed the dummy curiously. It was surprisingly lifelike. He had been taken in by it at first. A reasonable facsimile. Come to think of it, he had heard of this dummy, except in vision screen. Few had seen Waldo in his own person. Those who had business at Wheelchair know Freehold, he must remember that. Those who had business in Freehold heard a voice and saw this simulacrum. "But you must stay for dinner, Uncle Gus," Waldo continued. "You can't run out on me like that. You don't come here often enough for that." "I can stir something up." "Maybe we will," Grimes admitted. "Don't worry about the menu. You know me. I can eat a turtle with the shell." It had really been a bright idea, Stevens congratulated himself, to get Doc Grimes to bring him. Not here 5 minutes, and Waldo was insisting on them staying for dinner. Good omen. He had noticed that Waldo had addressed the invitation to Grimes alone, and that it had been Grimes who had assumed the invitation to be for both of them. "Where are you, Waldo?" Grimes continued. "In the lab?" He made a tentative movement as if to leave the reception room. "Oh, don't bother," Waldo said hastily. "I'm sure you will be more comfortable where you are. Just a moment, and I will put some spin on the room so that you may sit down." "What's eating you, Waldo?" Grimes said testily. "You know I don't insist on weight, and I don't care for the company of your talking doll. I want to see you." Stevens was a little surprised by the older man's insistence. He had thought it considerate of Waldo to offer to supply acceleration. Weightlessness put him a little on edge. Waldo was silent for an uncomfortable period. At last he said frigidly, "Really, Uncle Gus, what you ask is out of the question. You must be aware of that." Grimes did not answer him. Instead, he took Stephen's arm. "Come on, Jimmy, we're leaving." "Why, Doc, what's the matter?" "Waldo wants to play games, and I don't play games." "But—" "Never mind. Come along. Waldo, open the lock." "Uncle Gus." "Yes, Waldo?" "Your guest. You vouch for him?" "Naturally, you dumb fool, else I wouldn't have brought him." "You will find me in my workship. The way is open." Grimes turned to Stevens. "Come along, son." Stevens trailed after Grimes, as one fish might follow another, while taking in with his eyes as much of Waldo's fabulous house as he could. The place was certainly unique, he conceded to himself, unlike anything he had ever seen. It completely lacked up-and-down orientation. Spacecraft, even space stations, although always in free fall with respect to any but internally impressed accelerations, invariably are designed with ups and downs. The up-and-down axis of a ship is determined by the direction of its accelerating drive. The up and down of a space station is determined by its centrifugal spin. Some few police and military crafts use more than one axis of acceleration. Their ups and down shifts, therefore, and their personnel must be harnessed when the ship maneuvers. Some space stations apply spin only to living quarters. Nevertheless, the rule is general. Human beings are used to weight. All their artifacts have that assumption implicit in their construction, except Waldo's house. It's hard for a groundhog to dismiss the notion of weight. We seem to be born with an instinct which demands it. If one thinks of a vessel in a free orbit around the Earth, one is inclined to think of the direction towards the Earth as down, to think of oneself as standing or sitting on that wall of the ship, using it as a floor. Such a concept is completely mistaken. To a person inside a free-falling body, there is no sensation of weight whatsoever, and no direction of up and down, except that which derives from the gravitational field of the vessel itself. As for the latter, neither Waldo's house nor any spacecraft as yet built is massive enough to produce a field dense enough for the human body to notice it. Believe it or not, that is true. It takes a mass as gross as a good-sized planetoid to give the human body a feeling of weight. It may be objected that a body in a free orbit around the Earth is not a freely falling body. The concept involved is human, Earth's surface in type, and completely erroneous. Free flight, free fall, and free orbit are equivalent terms. The moon falls constantly toward the Earth. The Earth falls constantly toward the sun, but the sidewise vector of their several motions prevents them from approaching their primaries. It is free fall nonetheless. Consult any ballistician or astrophysicist. When there is free fall, there is no sensation of weight. A gravitational field must be opposed to be detected by the human body. Some of these considerations passed through Stephen's mind as he hand-walked his way to Waldo's workshop. Waldo's home had been constructed without any consideration being given to up and down. Furniture and apparatus were affixed to any wall. There was no floor. Decks and platforms were arranged at any convenient angle and of any size or shape, since they had nothing to do with standing or walking. Properly speaking, there were bulkheads and working surfaces rather than decks. Furthermore, equipment was not necessarily placed close to such surfaces. Frequently, it was more convenient to locate it with space all around it, held in place by light guys or slender stanchions. The furniture and equipment was all odd in design and frequently odd in purpose. Most furniture on Earth is extremely rugged. At least 90% of it has a single purpose, to oppose, in one way or another, the acceleration of gravity. Most of the furniture in an Earth surface or subsurface house is stator machines intended to oppose gravity. All tables, chairs, beds, couches, clothing racks, shelves, drawers, etc. have that as their one purpose. All other furniture and equipment have it as a secondary purpose, which strongly conditions design and strength. The lack of need for the rugged strength necessary to all terrestrial equipment resulted in a fairy-like grace in much of the equipment in Waldo's house. Stored supplies, massive in themselves, could be retained in convenient order by compartmentation of eggshell-thin transparent plastic. Ponderous machinery, which on Earth would necessarily be heavily cased and supported, was here either open to the air or covered by gossamer-like envelopes and held stationary by light elastic lines. Everywhere were pairs of Waldos, large, small, and life-size, with vision pickups to match. It was evident that Waldo could make use of the compartments through which they were passing without stirring out of his easy chair, if he used an easy chair. The ubiquitous Waldos, the insubstantial quality of the furniture, and the casual use of all walls as work or storage surfaces gave the place a madly fantastic air. Stevens felt as if he were caught in a Disney. So far, the rooms were not living quarters. Stevens wondered what Waldo's private apartment could be like and tried to visualize what equipment would be appropriate. No chairs, no rugs, no bed, perhaps pictures? Something pretty clever in the way of indirect lighting, since the eyes might be turned in any direction. Communication instruments might be much the same, but what could a washstand be like, or a water tumbler, a trap bottle for the last, or would any container be necessary at all? He could not decide and realized that even a competent engineer may be confused in the face of mechanical conditions strange to him. What constitutes a good ashtray when there is no gravity to hold the debris in place? Did Waldo smoke? Suppose he played solitaire. How did he handle the cards? Magnetized cards, perhaps, in a magnetized playing surface? In through here, Jim. Grimes steadied himself with one hand, gesturing with the other. Stevens slid through the manhole indicated, and before he had had time to look around, he was startled by a menacing bass growl. He looked up. Charging through the air straight at him was an enormous mastiff, lips drawn back, jaws slavering. Its front legs were spread out stiffly as if to balance in flight. Its hind legs were drawn up under its lean belly. By voice and manner, it announced clearly its intention of tearing the intruder into pieces and then swallowing the pieces. "Baldur!" A voice cut through the air from some point beyond. The dog's ferocity wilted, but it could not check its lunge. A Waldo snaked out a good 30 feet and grasped it by the collar. "I am sorry, sir," the voice added. "My friend was not expecting you."